Hi, I'm Murray Klippenstein, an incumbent bencher asking for your re-election vote in the present election. I know what you're thinking. What do beautiful aerial video clips of Osgoode Hall have to do with the election? Let me explain. The Osgoode Hall building actually means something to me as a 3-decade-plus lawyer running to continue as part of our profession's governing body. To me, it's an important symbol of the rule of law that we are privileged to experience in Ontario and Canada. Now, don't get me wrong, I see lots of imperfections in our system, but compared to what we see elsewhere in this often nasty world and in the historical past, it really is something. I like learning from history, and my family goes back to rural Mennonite agricultural communities in Russia 100 years ago, in the exact territory where Russian and Ukrainian armies are now laying waste to the land in a tragic war. My ancestor communities back then saw their prosperous lives brutalized first by the Russian Revolution, then by the Russian Civil War, and then by the savagery of Stalinism, either through banishment to Siberia or outright executions. Basically, none of my ancestral community survived there. My grandmother, who fled to Canada as a young girl, having lived through it, used to refuse to answer questions from her curious young grandson about what it had been like. When my deeply religious father used to organize family prayer times every day, I used to hear my parents regularly thank God that we live in a free country. So I am grateful for the rule of law we have here, embodied to some extent and however imperfectly here in Osgoode Hall. I believe that our profession matters. But there are some trends and issues right now in the governance of our profession at the Law Society that worry me. So I am running in this election with a group of good candidates as the FullStop team who want to pull back the Law Society from its current course of financial carelessness, habitual regulatory expansion, and the radical adoption of a far-reaching wokist agenda. First, let me say something about finances. As a 3-decades-plus private practitioner, with 2 decades of running my own small firm, I really had to learn some serious money management. Manna may sometimes fall from heaven, but money rarely does. Careful management of expenses and careful attention to revenue were a continuing matter of survival, no less. That is a prudent sensibility that I do not see at the Law Society, and that's because I think the Law Society can simply cheerfully assume that the money will always come in from your fees. There are tens of thousands of lawyers who have no choice but to every year pay the dues that the Law Society demands. Hello, manna from heaven. Hello, cash cows. And the number of those dues-paying lawyers relentlessly goes up every year with Ontario's growing population. So the Law Society can pretty much assume that the money will always be there. That becomes an assumption at the Law Society which is quite simply rarely questioned. But again, that's money from you and from your clients. I and my FullStop colleagues think it is prudent and fair for us to ask at the Law Society, do we really need to spend this amount of money on this and that? And we have asked those questions. That's why, in the last 4 years, your fees have actually gone down for the first time in many years. In the last budget cycle, my Stop-Sop colleague Chi-Kun Shi and I brought forward a motion that staff should present to the benchers an alternative budget with a 10% reduction in expenses so that the benchers could at least evaluate what that would look like. The motion was peremptorily voted down by the majority, most of whom are running on the present Big Governance Coalition. Surely a serious attempt to see what some budget saving would look like is a responsible move. Now let's talk about mission creep. When, like the Law Society, one has a secure and seemingly growing source of funds, and one has a large staff, and one has a lot of legal power, what happens? Well, one tends to use them. It's really tempting. Here's an example. You probably just sent to the Law Society your compulsory annual filing. As part of that, you were compelled to answer dozens of very personal questions, including about your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, your religion. If you didn't answer them, you lose your license. Yes, having boxed you into a corner, the Law Society gave you the option for each question to say, I choose not to answer this question. But how's that for not so subtle pressure? And why? So that the Law Society can accumulate and manipulate and, frankly, misuse statistics, analyzed by expensive staff or consultants to justify all sorts of policies to intrude on your practice and livelihood. Look at some of the detailed internal firm management policies regarding personnel matters that the Law Society has forced upon hundreds of firms and legal workplaces. It's almost like you have a Law Society commissar sitting in your workplace every day. Finally, let me say a few words about how I believe the wokist ideology, or the wokist cult I'm going to say, has taken over the Law Society. I have addressed this elsewhere in considerable detail, so I won't say too much now. A part of that takeover is a gigantic policy package, a machine really, of wokist-inspired policies which the Law Society adopted a few years ago, which have only been partially implemented, but which are set to roll. Here's an example. The Law Society decided to amend the rules of professional conduct, which apply to all 60,000 of us lawyers individually, to make it a complainable offense to engage in systemic discrimination. You heard right. You and I apparently can be individually guilty of systemic discrimination. And anyone could launch such a complaint against any one of us, based on almost any kind of obscure circumstances. Think of some people who don't like you. They will be able to file such a complaint against you, that you are guilty of something systemic. And then the Law Society will, not might, but will, investigate the complaint. And that's not all. The Law Society is already formally committed to creating a specialized team with specialized training to investigate such complaints. To quote Mr. Burns, release the hounds. This is not some kind of dystopian speculation. This is an already formally adopted Law Society policy, just waiting to be implemented after this election. If elected, I and the FullStop group will simply say stop to these kinds of highly politicized excesses. To sum things up, I am respectfully suggesting that your vote to return me to a seat in convocation, along with my fellow FullStop members, would be a vote for good sense and prudence, financial prudence, mandate prudence, and political prudence. I invite you to return me to Osgoode Hall, for your sake and for the sake of our profession. Thank you for your consideration.